Okay, this is really a paper about general strikes, as will become clear in just a moment, or indeed may be clear if you've read the actual paper itself. The background to this really goes back to the 1980s and the discussion or the literature on tripartite consultation to reform welfare, pensions, labour markets, etc., particularly escalating late 80s, early 90s around the Maastricht criteria. Since then, what's happened is that there's been really a collapse in the incidence of consultation or social pacts over the last 5-6 years, and I'll present some figures on that in a moment. And that raises, I guess, for us an interesting question: how the unions continue to try and influence government policy, particularly when governments are trying to drive through some major and draconian reforms, particularly since 2008, 2009. Oftentimes they have resorted to general strikes, and sometimes these have been pursued in conjunction with social pacts negotiations, often in the absence of negotiations, as a way of forcing governments back to the bargaining table. And given, as we'll see in a moment, there's been an escalation of the incidence of general strikes in recent years in Western Europe. Hence our two questions. What's happened to the outcomes? In other words, when unions launched general strikes against government to try and block spending cuts, welfare reform, etc., what's happened to outcomes, particularly in recent years in the age of austerity? And secondly, what are the electoral consequences for governments? When governments face down unions that mobilised whatever numbers on the streets in a general strike, what happens, if anything, at the next election, other things equal? I'll come back to this in a second. I just want to tell you how we define a general strike very quickly, and then I'll come back. So it's a national work stoppage. That's the definition. You can read it for yourselves. It excludes certain categories of events. So we exclude regional stoppages. We exclude stoppages by single groups of workers, dock workers protesting against government legal changes. And we exclude strikes by employees against the government in its capacity as employer. So these are strikes against the government in its capacity as executive. And what's interesting is the red line shows you the number of social pacts signed each year in Western Europe, EU15 plus Norway, which is C80 through 2012. That's up and down, as you see, up until around 2007-8, and then there's a collapse down to 2012. So for the last 4 or 5 years, the red line, annual number of social pacts across Western Europe has dramatically fallen away. The general strikes line, on the other hand, has got a number of peaks, early 90s, again another early 2000s, and a third 2010-11, as were the austerity peak. So the number of general strikes has risen significantly. We have over 130 in the data set. Actually, it's particularly interesting because if you plotted a third line, but we didn't because it just gets very messy. If you plotted the third line, which is the incidence of strikes by unions against employers, like economic strikes, that will start up here and it's plummeting way down. Right? So the general strikes curve is going in exactly the opposite direction, rising frequency rather than decline. You'll see from this graph we've used numbers of general strikes. We did toy with the idea of trying to figure out how many people were actually involved in every particular general strike, and I have to say, rightly or wrongly, we gave up because we just couldn't get any reliable data, and all the estimates we got had order of magnitude ranges, so it wasn't possible. So we're using simple numbers. We've done some previous work on general strikes, and just quickly to sum this up because it's relevant to the story I'll tell in a moment. The increase in general strike frequency you've seen since 1980. The issues we classified there 5 ways. One of which is economic strikes, tax increases, cuts in spending. One interesting point is that if you look at the strikes from 80 through 2009, we estimate that about 40% have resulted in significant concessions from government to unions. I'll tell you in a moment how we get the concessional data. It's a bit problematic. And the concessions, as you'd expect, are most likely or more likely when you've got either Christian Democrat or centre governments, when you have coalition governments rather than single party, and obviously those two categories overlap. And also where unions were united, given that in most of Europe you've got competing or multiple union federations. There are 1 or 2 exceptional cases, but mostly there are multiple federations. Unions are much more likely to get results when all 2 or 3 or 4, or in the French case, who knows how many, exactly 6, 7, 8, depends how you count them. When they're all involved, you're much more likely to get results. If 1 or 2 defect, the probability of concessions drops very, very significantly. That's not a surprising point, but again, it becomes interesting when we get to the austerity period. We want to look at anti-austerity strikes, so strikes against, as it says there, against fiscal consolidation measures, anti-economic policy strikes. These have become much more common in the last 5 or 10 years. So if you go through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you've got a range of strikes on labour market reform, welfare reform, pensions, wages, and a very small portion on economic policy. The strikes to protest general economic policy, which is against whatever the stuff the government's doing, become much more prevalent the last 5 or 6 years. So really these are, as it were, the strikes of the austerity era, and that's really what we want to look at. The difficulty we had is there aren't that many of them. There's only about 50 or so since 2008. There is very serious problem in getting data on outcomes from these recent strikes. And so what we thought we'd do was we'd use strikes against economic policy over the entire period, 1980 through 2012, as a sort of proxy. I mean, whether that's reasonable or isn't, I don't know. But that was our way around the chronic data shortage problem. So what we're saying in effect is if a union launches a strike against economic policy in general in 85 or 90 or whatever, up to and including 2012, these are in effect economic anti-austerity strikes. Why would they be any different from strikes on other issues? A number of different reasons why. As far as concessions are concerned, it may well be the case that the logic of blame avoidance, which leads governments either to negotiate with unions and or to make concessions to strikes, no longer plays out in quite the same way. The government doesn't have to construct, but it's easy to construct a story about who's to blame for this. In the Southern European case, they can point to the Troika. So you don't need to construct an elaborate story by involving unions in negotiations, making concessions in order to drive through the reforms. It's much easier to drive them through and blame Brussels or Berlin. In terms of the influence on elections, what would you expect to see? I mean, arguably, strikes around economic policy affect huge numbers of people. And so arguably the electoral effects may be much greater than, say, a reform of the regulations on temporary working or part-time working, some disputes over welfare benefits, which will affect much smaller proportions of the population. So other things equal, you might think the electoral repercussions will be somewhat greater than strikes on non-economic policy issues. So we've got a data set on general strikes about which we're reasonably confident, although counting general strikes in Greece is a little tricky because every time we speak to Greek colleagues and say we've got 40 or 50 or 60, whatever number we give them, they say, no, that's wrong. You've got the wrong number. There's 2 you missed out here and 3 there. So that's a bit of an issue, not a huge issue, I think. Concessions data is tricky. There isn't really a good data set. So what we've had to do is use documentary sources, mostly industrial relations business periodicals, which regularly document government proposals, union responses, negotiations, strikes, and then the final settlement, often in the form of a policy measure, a budget, or a bill. You can only really figure whether governments make concessions by treating the starting positions as genuine opening bids. In other words, you assume there's no game playing, and you assume the final settlements are indeed as published. So there are some problems with the concessions data, and there's some cases where we haven't been able to code, where we're not sure or we disagreed, we simply drop them out of the analysis altogether. And strikes and elections, again, that's fairly straightforward. As in both sets of regressions, there's a whole set of fairly standard control variables that we've used. So we're controlling for the part in governments, economic controls on employment, etc. Industrial relations controls, union density, bargaining, centralisation, which mostly don't do anything at all. Time trend, which often shows up, of course, in most econometrics, is significant. I can't read, that's not clear enough. 5 minutes. Okay. Okay. Results. The really big point, I guess, here is that the strikes against economic policy, which, like the recent strikes, have a success rate which is astonishingly low. In contrast, if you look at strikes over this period, strikes on pension reform or welfare reform, because we're coding the issues for all these strikes. Pension and welfare reforms, there's a very high probability that unions will extract some concessions from governments as a result of general strikes. So from a union point of view, these are very effective forms of collective action. When it comes to economic strikes, a 7.4 chance of concessions, which basically means nil. It basically means over the last 5-6 years, virtually all the strikes against economic policy on which we have any data have been completely unsuccessful. And what's also interesting about the recent strikes is that the normal predictors of union success don't seem any longer to work. So recall I said a few moments ago that union unity is a strong predictor. If all the confederations are involved in the strike, or both in Portugal, etc., both in Spain and so on, probability of strike success is significantly increased. Once you're in the austerity era, or like you're fighting strikes on economic policy, union unity makes no difference at all. So this chart simply shows you the probability of concessions and those are the red dots, and the confidence intervals around those. So you see for non-fiscal consolidation strikes, these are strikes against pensions, welfare, etc., where unions are fragmented, which means some are joining in the strike, others are not, a very low probability of concessions. Where they're all involved, very high probability. It makes an enormous difference. Move to the fiscal consolidation strikes, the economic strikes, and not surprisingly, because there's kind of data issue here, of course, a variable score issue. Because there are so few concessions, union unity now makes no difference. It doesn't really matter whether both Spanish unions or just one of them are involved in the general strike, 11, 12, 13, against austerity. They're basically going to lose. Same with governments. It no longer matters whether you've got coalition, single party, Christian Democrat, left or right. Those variables which mattered previously on other issues no longer seem to make a difference. Again, the story, sadly, is that you, from the union perspective, is they lose. However, when you look at the electoral consequences, again, the familiar variables make sense, and they play out as you'd expect. There's a negative incumbency effect, so the main party in the government will lose vote share from one election to the next, other things equal. State of the economy has an effect of GDP growth is positive, the government will gain, the main party will gain vote share. What's interesting is that strike frequency makes a difference. General strikes under the tenure of the government actually do some damage. That's 2 minutes, I can see that. It does some damage. So on average, depends on which model you look at, around 2.2 drop in vote share, 4% reduction in the probability of re-election. So even when unions get nothing at all out of governments and ostensibly suffer an overwhelming defeat, actually it also happens the government suffers a defeat as well on a small scale at the subsequent election. So they may not be able to gain anything for their members, but they can inflict some costs on the government. If, however, the governments have negotiated social pacts, there is some evidence that actually negotiating social pacts, trying to be inclusive with unions as a way of buying off or avoiding protest, actually gives you vote share gains and somewhat higher probability of re-election. So the very thing that actually would be beneficial for governments is the thing they're doing less and less over the last few years. So the last few years, what's been happening on general strikes is that governments have seen less and less incentive and have less ability to make any concession to unions. This is particularly the case in Southern Europe, which is where most of the general strikes occur, partly because of external pressure. So they've got nothing to offer, nothing to bargain. Unions, likewise, even if they were offered social pacts, have got very little incentive to negotiate because they're going to come out simply endorsing these austerity programs. So they launch protest strikes, which generate nothing at all. So they make no gains. In a sense, they lose because they can't stop the austerity policies. But meantime, the government lose in a way, kind of, because they lose vote share and probability of re-election. So they all end up losing. That's not a very positive outcome, I have to say, but that's really the story about the general strikes in the age of austerity. But pre-austerity, just to end on a slightly more positive note, 4 of the 10 general strikes extracted some significant concessions from governments, which I don't know what to compare it to, but that seems to me not a bad hit rate for unions. Okay, that's the end. Thanks very much.